5 seconds. That is what a false start cost Lewis Hamilton at Silverstone this season. 5 seconds added to his race on home ground, in front of a grandstand that has been showing up for him for 19 years. And months later, in a closed room in Budapest, Hamilton put that penalty on the table in front of the governing body, made his argument, and by his own account, the FIA agreed with him. Nobody gave the 5 seconds back. Nobody moved the classification. The championship table still carries it exactly as it was written on the day. Let me build this properly, because the temptation here is to shout, and shouting will get this wrong. Start with the season cold. Hamilton went into the summer break, sitting second in the Drivers' Championship, 50 points behind Kimi Antonelli. He arrived at that break carrying 4 penalties collected across 3 race weekends. Silverstone, 5 seconds, false start. Spa, 5 seconds, causing a collision with George Russell on the opening lap. Hungary on the Saturday, a 3-place grid drop for impeding Oscar Piastri in the 3rd phase of qualifying. Hungary on the Sunday, 5 more seconds, for exceeding the pit lane speed limit by 0.1 kilometers per hour. 4 and 3, that is the streak everybody has been arguing about since the break started. Before I go into what was actually said in that room, do me a favor. Subscribe, because the grid comes back at Zandvoort and every single one of these threads gets tested again there. And tell me in the comments which country you are watching from. I genuinely read them, and this channel gets watched in places I never expected. Now, the briefing. This was not a leak, and it was not a rumor. Planet F1 reported, before the Hungarian Grand Prix, that stewarding and driving standards were going on to the agenda of the drivers' briefing at the Hungaroring, and that the Spa incidents were going to be at the top of that agenda. The meeting happened, and afterwards, speaking to Planet F1 and other media, Hamilton described what went on inside it. He raised the false start. He said the argument he made was that there have been drivers in the past who moved and were not penalized. He said the standard the drivers discussed was simple. As long as you are not moving when the lights are on, you should not be penalized, and he was not out of his box. And then he described the response in 3 syllables. They agreed. They agreed, he said, so they are looking into that. Now, here is where most channels covering this story go straight off a cliff, and I am not going to. Hamilton did not walk into that meeting claiming innocence. In the same conversation, unprompted, he said Silverstone was his fault at the start. Read those 2 things together, because together they are far more interesting than either one alone. He accepted that he moved. What he disputed was whether moving, in the way he moved, at the moment he moved it, should carry a penalty at all under the standard the sport has actually been applying to everybody else. That is not a driver asking for a favor. That is a driver asking for the same treatment as the drivers who came before him. And by his account, the room agreed with him. So let me interrogate that, question by question, because a sentence like "they agreed" needs pressure applied to it before anyone builds a theory on top. Question 1. Did the FIA issue a public statement reversing the penalty? No, there has been no such statement, and I am not going to pretend there was. Question 2. Did the result change? No. The 5 seconds stayed on the timing sheet at Silverstone. The finishing order stands. Question 3. Did the points move? No. Whatever position that 5 seconds cost, it still costs it. In a championship being measured in 50-point gaps, that number sits there permanently. Question 4. Is the standard itself being reviewed? According to Hamilton, yes. They are looking into it, is how he put it, which is an admission that something in the current standard needed looking at. And question 5, the only one that actually matters. If the guideline was clear and correctly applied, what exactly is there to look into? That is the gap in this story, not a conspiracy, a gap. Which brings us to the man who filled that gap in public. Johnny Herbert is not a talking head who wandered into this topic. He raced in Formula 1 and won at Silverstone. Then he spent years working as a steward for the governing body, sitting in that room with the guidelines open in front of him, making these exact calls under Sunday afternoon pressure. When he speaks about how the process works, he is describing his own former workplace. And on the 8th of August, Planet F1 reported what he said about Hamilton's streak. On the pit lane speeding penalty in Hungary, Herbert said it was Hamilton's fault. Full stop. You cannot blame anyone else. He said the Lewis of 10 years ago probably would not have done something like that, and that ultimately there are no excuses. Then he defended the room itself. He said the guidelines are there, plain and simple. He said there are 4 stewards who work closely together. He said consistency in handing out penalties is what teams and drivers always strive for, and that in his opinion, the stewards are doing an excellent job. And he added the line that closes the case for a lot of people. It is not as if the stewards have anything against Lewis. That is not how it works. I want to be fair to Herbert here, because he is describing something real. There is no plausible world in which 4 rotating officials sit down and decide to hunt one driver. That is not how a stewards panel functions, and anybody who has looked at how these rooms operate knows it. But hold the 2 positions next to each other and look at what happens. Position 1. The guidelines are plain and simple, applied consistently, and the room is doing an excellent job. Position 2. Hamilton took one of those applications to the driver's briefing, argued that it broke from precedent, and the governing body agreed and said it would look into the standard. Those 2 things are pulling in opposite directions. If the standard was fine, there is nothing to review. If there is something to review, the standard was not plain and simple on the day it was used against him. And here is the mirror case, because this is where the argument stops being about feelings and becomes about documents. Go back to Spa, the 19th of July. Fred Vasseur, speaking to F1 TV and to the assembled media, called the Hamilton penalty mega harsh. He said Russell had space on the left-hand side, that he was not close to the wall, and that for him it was a racing incident. But he said something quieter in the same session, and it is the sentence that carries weight. He said that so far that season, all of the incidents on lap 1 had been considered racing incidents. All of them. That is not an emotional claim. That is a description of a pattern of decisions, race after race, up to that Sunday. Cars touch in the opening chaos, the field is stacked, the stewards note it and wave it through. And then, at Spa on lap 1, that same standard produced a 5-second penalty. On a collision that George Russell, the driver whose race actually ended in the gravel, the man with every incentive on earth to want a punishment issued, called a racing incident. Now here is the part I insist on, because it is what separates this channel from the rage merchants. Taken on its own, that Spa decision defends itself. The stewards wrote their reasoning out. They said Russell had established sufficient overlap around the outside and was entitled to racing room. They said Hamilton's car understeered, that he applied corrective steering to avoid contact, and that contact happened anyway. They said the standard sanction for causing a collision is 10 seconds, and that they cut it to 5 because they themselves recognized mitigating circumstances. That document is coherent. Every one of these decisions is coherent read on its own. That is precisely the problem, because nobody experiences a season 1 document at a time. And now, hold that thought, because it has just widened. On the 16th of August, Planet F1 published a full itemized list of Kimi Antonelli's penalties and punishments across the season. Time additions, a grid drop, warnings, a reprimand, all of it laid out line by line. On the same Sunday, their news roundup brought Herbert back into circulation again, this time talking about the abuse stewards receive. So inside a single week, everything a person would need to compare is sitting in public. The championship leader's disciplinary record, itemized, the record of the man chasing him, 6 incidents deep across the season, and a former steward telling the audience the room is excellent and holds nothing against anybody. That has not been true at any earlier point this year. The material only became comparable this month. So here is your impossible choice, and I want it answered in the comments. You are Lewis Hamilton, 50 points down, with the second half of a title fight in front of you. Option 1, you keep raising this publicly and you accept that every steward for the rest of the season knows you named the room. Option 2, you go quiet, bank the goodwill, and accept that whatever the standard is, it keeps running. Which one do you pick? Like the video if you would speak up, comment if you would stay quiet. That is the vote. And subscribe while you are down there. Let me convert this into points, because August is when points stop being abstract. The 5 seconds at Silverstone did not stay at Silverstone. In a race where finishing positions were separated by less than that, 5 seconds is a place. A place is points. Points are the gap. Hamilton said on the record that the recent decisions cost him a lot of points. Vasseur said the Spa penalty cost the team a lot. And across that same stretch of 3 weekends, Antonelli's championship lead grew to 50. That is the mechanism, and it is why it is so hard to argue about. There is no single dramatic robbery to point at. There is a 5 here, a 3-place grid drop there, 5 more for 0.1 over a speed limit, until the gap has quietly grown by roughly the value of one strong result. And 0.1 kilometers per hour, for context, is a speed difference nobody standing at the pit wall could perceive. It is smaller than the natural variation in a human foot releasing a limiter button. There is also a structural reason this keeps producing arguments, and it has nothing to do with anybody disliking anybody. Stewarding panels rotate. The 4 people in the room this weekend are not the 4 from the last one. They arrive, they read the same written guidelines, they receive telemetry, they decide under time pressure, and then they leave. Consistency is supposed to live in the document rather than in the people. That works beautifully when a machine measured the offense. A pit lane limiter is a number. 80 is 80. It works far less beautifully when the question is what racing room means in a corner where 2 cars touched at 200 kilometers an hour. And that is exactly where the disputes cluster. I should be honest about the edge of what I can tell you. I do not know what was said in that briefing room beyond what Hamilton described. I do not know whether the FIA's people in there considered it a concession or a courtesy. Nobody outside that room does, and anyone telling you otherwise is guessing. Now, the strongest case against everything I have just laid out, stated properly. Hamilton moved, he said so himself. A false start is a false start, and if the sport starts negotiating what counts as movement, it has no start procedure left. Herbert is also right about the pit lane, completely right, and Hamilton accepted 2 of the 4 penalties without anyone forcing him to. And they agreed is one man's account of a private meeting, reported by one outlet, with no confirming statement from the governing body attached to it. A 7-time champion picking up 4 sanctions in 3 weekends is, at absolute minimum, a driver in a rough patch. Every word of that is defensible, and I am not going to pretend it is not. But it does not close the gap, because the streak, broken into its parts, contains 2 penalties. Hamilton accepted immediately and publicly, one for a collision the injured driver called racing, and one that he took into a room with the governing body, argued, and by his account won. Subscribe before the reading, because the Antonelli comparison is the next video on this channel, and you will want those 2 lists side by side. So, the reading. Nothing in this proves that anybody set out to punish Lewis Hamilton. I need to be exact about that because the second a channel starts asserting motive, it stops being worth your time. I cannot see intent, and neither can anyone else outside those rooms. What I can see is a sequence. A penalty was issued. The driver accepted his part in it and disputed the standard behind it. He took that dispute to the governing body in front of the other drivers. By his account, they agreed with him and said they would look into it. The standard may change for everybody who comes next, and the 5 seconds are still there. That is not an accusation. That is a legitimate question, and it is this. If a governing body concedes privately that a rule needed reviewing, what happens to the result it already produced? Is the answer that nothing happens and everyone simply carries the number forward into a 50-point championship? Ferrari will not enjoy the answer they are being handed, because the tidy version now carries a badge. Hamilton makes errors, the stewards apply the rules, a former steward confirms the room is excellent. Move on, next question. And Ferrari walks into Zandvoort with an all-new chassis and into Monza with an engine upgrade, carrying a driver. The paddock has been told is the problem rather than the pattern. Zandvoort is the test, and it comes fast. Watch lap 1 there, watch what gets called a racing incident, watch who it happens to. Tell me in the comments what you think that steward's room does on the first lap at Zandvoort. I will be reading every one of them. Like the video if the comparison landed, subscribe so the Antonelli list reaches you when it drops, and I will see you until the next one.